The first whispers came late one summer evening, when the air in Houston was thick with heat and the streets buzzed with life. A single post on social media lit the spark. Another body pulled from the bayou. Cops not saying anything. Serial killer? Within hours, screenshots spread like wildfire across Facebook groups, Reddit threads, and TikTok videos. People claimed to have seen police boats in the water, flashing lights on bridges, and investigators pulling black bags from the murky depths. By midnight, panic was no longer just a rumor, it was a storm. Hashtags like Bayou Bodies and Houston Killer began trending. TikTokers filmed themselves near the bayou, whispering about missing people, their videos scored with eerie music. Twitter filled with maps of Houston waterways, red pins marking supposed dump sites. Strangers who had never spoken before were suddenly united in a single thought. Something sinister was happening in the bayou. The next morning, the story exploded beyond the internet. Local news stations covered the chatter, interviewing worried residents. A mother told reporters she no longer let her kids walk to school near the water. A jogger described seeing police cape along a trail where he usually ran. Even without hard evidence, fear had already gripped the city. And then, as if to feed the fire, another body was found. This time, it wasn't just rumor. Officers confirmed that a man's remains had been pulled from the water near Bray's Bayou, but the circumstances were unclear. Was it an accident, suicide, or the work of a killer? Police refused to give details, and their silence only fueled the hysteria. I remember that morning clearly, standing among the crowd of onlookers near the bayou bank. People whispered theories like they were passing secrets. Drug cartel hits, human trafficking, ritual killings. Every idea seemed more terrifying than the last. What struck me most wasn't the crime itself, it was the fear, the way rumors had taken on a life of their own. The line between truth and speculation blurred, and the city found itself staring into the dark waters, convinced a monster was hiding below. For law enforcement, this was the beginning of a nightmare. Not just because of what might be true, but because of the tidal wave of fear that could no longer be contained. The official word from Houston police came 2 days later, but by then, the rumor mill had already done its damage. At a press conference, a spokesperson stood stiffly behind the podium, the hum of cameras filling the room. His statement was short, cautious. At this time, we can confirm the recovery of human remains from Bray Bayou. The investigation is ongoing, but there is no evidence to suggest a serial offender is responsible. It was meant to calm the city. Instead, it had the opposite effect. On social media, the denial became proof in itself. Of course, they're covering it up, one post read, gaining thousands of shares. Another TikTok video showed drone footage of the bayou with blurred shapes under the water. The caption screamed, "They're hiding the bodies!" Neighborhood groups turned into rumor hubs. People posted about missing dogs, abandoned shoes by the water, strange vans parked near trails. Every small detail, no matter how ordinary, was twisted into evidence of a larger conspiracy. The city wasn't just worried, they were convinced. For the police, every rumor meant more work. Officers fielded calls about supposed dump sites and rushed to check areas that turned up nothing but trash and tree branches. Meanwhile, detectives tried to piece together the truth, a string of drownings, overdoses, and accidents that had plagued Houston's waterways for years. But separating fact from fiction became harder each day. I rode along with one of the search teams that week. We launched a small boat into the bayou at dawn, the water a murky green under the rising sun. The officers scanned the surface, their expressions hard, knowing the world was watching every move. The smell of decay lingered in the humid air, and though part of me knew most of these discoveries would turn out to be false alarms, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out here, a real secret was waiting to surface. By nightfall, the press coverage only intensified. One news anchor looked straight into the camera and asked the question everyone whispered, but no one could answer. Is Houston hiding a serial killer in plain sight?
3 days after the press conference, the call came in from a jogger who often ran along Bray's Bayou. His voice on the 911 recording was shaky, panicked. He swore he saw something tangled in the reeds, something that looked like a human hand. By the time officers arrived, news vans were already parked on the roadside. Cameras zoomed in as the crime scene tape went up, and the story exploded before the investigators could even confirm what they were dealing with. The crowd grew thick, people holding up their phones, live streaming every move the officers made. When the recovery team finally pulled the object from the water, the truth was more unsettling than anyone expected. It wasn't just a hand, it was a nearly intact body, badly decomposed, but unmistakably human. The reaction was immediate and fierce. Shouts erupted from the gathered crowd. "We told you so!" and "They can't cover this up anymore!" Inside the department, panic quietly spread. Detectives already had a list of missing persons tied to the Houston area, and now they had to ask themselves, whose body was this, and how long had it been down there? That night, social media drowned in theories. Some users posted side-by-side photos of missing young men, trying to match tattoos and scars with blurry images leaked from the bayou. TikTok sleuths analyzed the color of the clothing, suggesting it matched one of the most high-profile disappearances from the year before. And yet, for every claim, another denial followed. Authorities released no name, no details, citing the ongoing forensic process. But silence only fueled the storm. I stood near the scene, recording my notes, watching as the flashing red and blue lights reflected off the bayou water. In that moment, it felt less like an investigation and more like a city on trial. The people of Houston weren't waiting for answers anymore. They were demanding them, and every passing hour without clarity gave birth to a new rumor, a new ghost story whispered about the waters. By sunrise, the headlines were everywhere. Bayou body found, Houston's dark secret unfolds.
The Harris County morgue was silent, except for the low hum of fluorescent lights. Forensic pathologists worked methodically, every movement deliberate, every detail recorded. The decomposed body, pulled from Bray's Bayou, was placed on a stainless steel table. The smell of decay, heavy in the room despite industrial-strength ventilation. Hours later, the report reached the investigators, and it only deepened the mystery. The body belonged to a young man in his early 20s. Cause of death? Undetermined. No obvious gunshot wounds, no stab marks, no blunt force trauma. Toxicology was still pending, but the absence of visible injuries raised more questions than answers. The most chilling detail, however, wasn't about how he died. It was about how long he had been in the water. The forensic team estimated the body had been submerged for nearly 6 months. That timeline didn't match with any of the recent missing persons cases. It suggested something larger, something buried deeper in Houston's past. When the detectives presented this finding at headquarters, frustration erupted. Some argued it pointed to an accidental drowning, while others whispered what the public had already decided, that this was no accident. The city was haunted by rumors of a predator targeting men near the bayous, and the discovery seemed to confirm everyone's worst suspicions. That night,
Leaks from inside the department spread online. Screenshots of supposed autopsy notes began circulating on Reddit, fueling endless speculation. Amateur sleuths connected the dots to a missing college student from last year, claiming his clothing matched the victim's. Others swore it was proof of a serial killer, someone smart enough to dump bodies where they wouldn't be found for months. Meanwhile, the police issued another, carefully worded statement. The investigation is active, and we urge the public not to jump to conclusions. But it was already too late. The people didn't trust reassurances. They wanted justice, or at least someone to blame. I sat in my car outside the morgue, staring at the glow of my recorder. As an officer, I was supposed to deal in facts, not fears. But after seeing the body, after reading the timeline, I couldn't shake the thought gnawing at me. If this young man had been lying under the water for months unnoticed, how many others are still out there waiting to be found?
2 days after the morgue findings leaked, a woman walked into the precinct with a story that made every detective in the room sit up straight. She introduced herself as Carla, a nurse who lived just a few blocks from Bayou. Her hands trembled as she clutched a worn notebook, its pages filled with scribbled dates and times. Carla claimed she had been keeping track of strange activity near the bayou for nearly a year. On several nights, she said, she saw a dark pickup truck parked along the service road at odd hours, sometimes with its lights off, sometimes idling for hours with no one stepping out. She remembered one night vividly, the sound of a splash around 2 a.m., followed by the truck pulling away. At first, detectives thought her story might be the product of paranoia, but then she opened her notebook. The dates she'd recorded lined up eerily well with reported missing persons cases in Houston. The coincidence was too sharp to ignore. Investigators dispatched a team to canvass the area. Sure enough, a few residents backed up Carla's claims. They too had seen a truck, sometimes black, sometimes dark blue, lurking near the water. One man said he even called it in months ago, but was told it was probably nothing. The rumors online exploded again. "The Bayou Killer drives a truck," headlines screamed. Social media lit up with grainy photos of pickups all over Houston, users accusing strangers of being the killer. Innocent drivers suddenly found themselves harassed, their license plates shared online, their faces splashed across conspiracy forums. Inside the department, the pressure mounted. Was this the lead they'd been waiting for, or just another distraction? Surveillance cameras in the area offered little clarity. Most were outdated, capturing little more than fuzzy headlights passing by in the dark. I interviewed Carla myself. Her voice cracked as she repeated her story, insisting she wasn't looking for attention, only that she couldn't stay silent anymore. The fear in her eyes was real. She believed what she saw, and deep down, I believed her too. As I left her apartment, her final words echoed in my mind. If they don't stop him, more will end up in that water. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside my window felt heavier, every shadow more threatening. For the first time since the rumors began, I wondered if the city wasn't just imagining a killer. Maybe it had been living with one all along.
The department didn't waste time after Carla's testimony. Within 48 hours, unmarked patrol cars were stationed along key stretches of Bayou. Detectives rotated shifts, sitting in the dark with binoculars and long-range cameras, waiting for the mysterious truck to appear. Officially, the operation didn't exist. No press releases, no updates. The higher-ups knew that if word leaked, half the city would be parked by the bayou with lawn chairs and cell phones, ready to live stream the hunt. But inside the squad, everyone felt the tension. We weren't just chasing shadows anymore. We were chasing a man who might already be watching us back. On the third night of surveillance, just after 2 a.m., a detective spotted headlights creeping along the service road near one of the oldest bridges crossing the bayou. The vehicle was a dark pickup, just as Carla had described. It stopped for several minutes, engine idling, before slowly rolling forward again. The team followed from a distance, radios whispering updates. The driver pulled over near a secluded bend of the water, stepped out, and leaned against the railing. Through binoculars, he looked like an ordinary middle-aged man. Jeans, ball cap, nothing remarkable. But what unsettled everyone was how long he just stood there, staring into the water as if he were waiting for something to rise. Before officers could move in, a pair of joggers appeared on the trail. The man quickly jumped back into his truck and drove off, disappearing into the sprawl of Houston's streets. The license plate was caught on camera. Back at headquarters, detectives ran the numbers. The name that came up wasn't on any watch list, wasn't tied to any known crimes. Just a regular guy with a job, an address, and no record. Still, the unease lingered. Why was he at the bayou at that hour, night after night? Why did he leave so suddenly when people approached? The department debated whether to bring him in or keep watching. Half argued they needed hard evidence before making a move. The other half insisted waiting might cost another life. I couldn't shake the image of that man by the railing, gazing into the water like he'd left something there, something or someone. And for the first time in weeks, I realized the rumors weren't just feeding the city's fear. They were feeding ours too.
The surveillance operation was supposed to be confidential, but in Houston, secrets don't last long. By the end of the week, a local blogger broke the story. Police eye dark pickup truck in Bayou body case. Within hours, the headline was everywhere, from Twitter threads to primetime news. The man we had quietly been watching was suddenly plastered across social media. Photos of his truck, pulled from public records and Google Street View, went viral. People claimed to see him in gas stations, diners, even grocery store parking lots. Strangers began snapping photos of every dark pickup in the city, convinced they were hunting the so-called Bayou Killer. Inside the department, chaos followed. Detectives slammed doors, cursing the leak. Not only had the operation been compromised, but now an ordinary citizen, guilty or not, was a marked man. The suspect hadn't been charged with anything, but online, he had already been tried and convicted. News crews staked out his house. Neighbors gave interviews about how he kept to himself and wasn't the friendly type. Every mundane detail of his life became evidence. A bag of trash by his curb, proof. A yard unkempt, suspicion. His quiet personality, confirmation of guilt. We doubled the surveillance, not just to watch him, but to protect him. The fear in the city had reached a boiling point, and vigilante justice felt closer with every passing day. Meanwhile, the man himself carried on as if nothing had changed. He drove to work, picked up groceries, mowed his lawn under the glare of cameras. But at night, there were whispers that his truck was still seen by the bayou, parked in those lonely stretches where no one else went. I sat in my car across from his home one evening, notebook open, voice recorder humming. Part of me wanted to believe the rumors had taken over, that the man was just a scapegoat caught in the storm. But another part, the part that had stared into Bray's Bayou's black water, kept wondering if maybe the city had found its monster after all.
That night, as I drove back toward downtown, a call came over the radio. Another body had been discovered near the bayou. And this time, the city wasn't going to accept silence.
The scene was chaos before we even arrived. Red and blue lights painted the sky above Bray's Bayou, and a crowd pressed against the crime scene tape, their voices sharp with fear and anger. Word had spread instantly. Another body pulled from the water. This time it wasn't rumor, it was real. The victim was a young woman, early 20s, her body found tangled beneath a cluster of branches near an overpass. Unlike the last case, decomposition hadn't erased the details. She had been in the water only a few days. Her clothing was intact, her shoes still laced, and her hands showed signs of restraint. This wasn't an accident, it was deliberate. The air around the investigators was electric. Detectives whispered in clipped tones, their expressions grim. For the first time, the whispers of a serial predator didn't sound like conspiracy. They sounded like possibility. The media swarmed within minutes. Helicopters hovered overhead, their spotlights cutting across the water. Reporters shouted questions at anyone in uniform, demanding confirmation, demanding answers. Every word we said or didn't say would ripple across the entire city by morning. At headquarters, the pressure exploded. 2 bodies in the same bayou within weeks, one recent, 1 month old. The higher-ups could no longer dismiss the fear as online hysteria. They formed a task force overnight, pulling detectives from across the city. The FBI even sent an observer, though officially this wasn't their case yet. Behind closed doors, a new theory began to form. The truck wasn't just a coincidence. Whoever drove it might have escalated. If the first victim had been hidden for months, maybe this new one was meant as a message, a dare, left where we couldn't ignore it. Social media went into overdrive. Photos of the young woman spread within hours, her identity pieced together from missing person flyers by self-proclaimed internet detectives. Hashtags trended worldwide. Hashtag Bayou Killer. Hashtag Who Is Next. Hashtag Houston Horror. That night, as I stood near the water's edge, the smell of rotten gasoline hanging in the humid air, I knew the city had crossed a line. The rumors were no longer just stories whispered online. They had become real, bleeding into the streets, into our patrols, into our own fear. Somewhere out there, whether guilty or innocent, the man with the truck had to be watching.
By morning, the suspect's house was surrounded, not by police, but by people. Neighbors, strangers, even amateur vigilantes with phones in their hands and anger in their eyes. They shouted his windows, demanding answers, calling him a murderer. Some carried signs scrawled with messages like "Justice for the Bayou victims." Inside the department, the pressure became unbearable. Detectives argued in the briefing room, some demanding an immediate arrest to calm the city, others warning that without solid evidence, it would fall apart in court. The truth was simple. We had suspicions, not proof, and suspicion doesn't win convictions. Still, the discovery of the young woman had changed everything. She wasn't just another statistic. Her family had been vocal, appearing on local news, their faces etched with grief. Their parents begged for justice, their sobs carried live on TV. Houston was no longer watching quietly. It was demanding blood. That afternoon, surveillance units reported movement. The suspect's truck pulled out of his driveway, followed by unmarked cars keeping their distance. He didn't go to work, didn't head to a store. Instead, he drove aimlessly through side streets, across bridges, along stretches of the very bayou where the bodies had been found. It felt less like a commute and more like a ritual. Then something unexpected happened. He stopped at a small convenience store. The cameras inside captured him buying nothing unusual, just gas, snacks, a bottle of water. But as he walked past a bulletin board near the register, his eyes locked on the missing person flyer for the young woman we had just pulled from the water. He froze, staring at it far too long. The clerk noticed. Later, she told us she felt a chill. She said it wasn't just a glance. It was like he was remembering her. When he finally stepped outside, his shoulders hunched, his jaw tight, he didn't drive home. He headed back toward the bayou. That night, detectives debated moving in. Some said it was the moment. We couldn't let him slip through our fingers. Others argued it was too thin. Watching a flyer didn't prove guilt. But for me, sitting in my cruiser with eyes glued to the dark outline of his truck by the water, the question wasn't about evidence anymore. The question was, if we waited any longer, how many more bodies would the bayou claim?
The decision came just after midnight. The task force couldn't risk another body turning up. Orders were given, bring him in. No formal arrest yet, just questioning, just pressure. But everyone in that room knew the truth. This was a gamble. We tailed him from the bayou, unmarked cars weaving through Houston's late-night traffic. When his truck pulled into a gas station on the outskirts of town, the call went out. Within seconds, black SUVs boxed him in, red and blue lights exploding against the concrete. He didn't resist. He raised his hands calmly, almost like he'd been expecting this moment all along. His face, pale in the glare of the floodlights, gave nothing away. No panic, no confusion, just a quiet, unsettling acceptance. Back at headquarters, he sat in the interrogation room under the harsh buzz of fluorescent lights. Detectives fired question after question. Where he'd been, why he was near the bayou, what he knew about the victims. His answers were maddeningly simple, almost rehearsed. He was just a man who liked night drives, who found the bayou peaceful, who had nothing to do with the bodies. When asked about the missing woman, the one whose flyer he stared at in the store, he smiled faintly. "Everyone's seen that flyer," he said. "Doesn't mean I knew her." Hours passed. No confession, no slip, nothing to tie him directly to the crime scenes. His truck was searched top to bottom. No blood, no restraints, no signs of foul play. Just a few tools, fast food wrappers, and a pair of muddy boots. But the boots unsettled me. The mud on them looked fresh, too fresh. Forensics took them for testing, but results would take days. Meanwhile, the city's anger boiled outside. News of his detainment had leaked, and crowds gathered near the precinct, chanting, demanding justice. Inside the station, the detectives' frustration turned to dread. If we released him without charges, Houston might riot. But if we held him without evidence, the case could collapse before it even began. I watched him through the glass as he sat motionless, hands folded on the table, eyes fixed on some invisible point in the distance. He didn't look like a man trapped. He looked like a man waiting. And in that moment, I realized something chilling. Whether he was guilty or not, the real danger might not just be him. It might be what the city was willing to become in order to stop him.
The results came back 3 days later. Everyone in the task force had been holding their breath, waiting for something, anything that could tip the balance. When the forensic team finally walked in with their folders, the room fell silent. The mud on the suspect's boots wasn't just ordinary dirt. Tests showed traces of industrial chemicals, residue commonly found near a disused drainage tunnel connected to Bayou. That tunnel had been sealed off for years, considered too unstable for public access. Officially, no one should have been down there. A search team was dispatched immediately. We crawled through the narrow, damp concrete passage, flashlights cutting through the pitch black. The air smelled of rot and rust. Then, deep in the tunnel, we found something that stopped us cold. A small collection of personal belongings. A purse, half buried under silt, a man's wallet, its leather stiff with water damage, a pair of sneakers, child-sized, laces knotted tight. Each item tagged and bagged by evidence techs, each one tied to missing persons whose families had been waiting for answers. But the most chilling find was further in. A length of rope, frayed at the ends, caked with dried mud. It wasn't proof of murder by itself, but paired with the belongings, it painted a picture too dark to ignore. When we brought this evidence back to headquarters, the room was electric. Half the team was ready to charge the suspect immediately. The other half argued it was still circumstantial, that a defense attorney could tear it apart. The debate turned heated, voices rising, fists slamming on tables. Meanwhile, the suspect sat in his holding cell, calm as ever. When told about the tunnel, his only response was a faint smirk. "You think that proves something?" he asked. "People dump all kinds of trash down there." But I had been inside that tunnel. I had seen the sneakers. I had felt the weight of that rope in my hands. It didn't feel like trash. It felt like secrets buried in the dark. Secrets someone thought would never be found. That night, as the city chanted outside the station for justice, I realized the case had crossed a line. We weren't just chasing a rumor anymore. We were staring at something real, something that had been festering under Houston streets for years. And if the tunnel was just the beginning, I feared what else the bayou might be hiding.
The tunnel discovery had the whole department convinced they were finally closing in. Evidence bags piled on the table like puzzle pieces waiting to be assembled. Families of the missing crowded outside the station, convinced their long wait for answers was nearly over. But just when it seemed the case was tightening around the suspect, everything unraveled. Late one evening, a detective burst into the briefing room with a folder in hand. Security footage had surfaced from a liquor store across town. Footage timestamped the very night the young woman was believed to have been killed. The problem? The man we had in custody was clearly visible in the video, buying beer and cigarettes, miles away from the bayou. The receipt even matched the time on the store's cameras. An alibi. Solid, undeniable. The room went silent. All the energy, all the certainty drained out at once. Some detectives stared at the floor, others crushed under their breath. Months of suspicion, weeks of surveillance, and now it looked like the city's supposed Bayou Killer might not be a killer at all. When confronted with the footage, the suspect leaned back in his chair, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Told you, I didn't do it." But for me, the relief never came. If he wasn't the one, then who was? The tunnel still held belongings tied to the missing. The rope, the sneakers, the wallet. They were real, undeniable. Someone had put them there. If not him, then someone else. Worse yet, the public didn't care about the alibi. The The news had already branded him the Bayou Killer. Protesters outside still screamed for justice. Families of the victims demanded he be charged. The truth didn't matter anymore. The story had grown too big, too dark to stop. Back in the precinct, I flipped through the case files, staring at the faces of the missing. The evidence didn't add up, not neatly. It pointed in too many directions, and in the pit of my stomach, I felt the dread return. Because if the man in custody wasn't guilty, that meant the real killer was still out there, watching, waiting, maybe even laughing at the chaos we'd created. And Houston, blinded by fear, was too busy chasing the wrong man to see it.
The next morning, before the sun had even broken the horizon, the precinct phone rang. A fisherman from the bayou had called in, said he'd found something tangled in his nets, something he didn't ever want to see again. When I got there, the scene was grim. Pulled up onto the shore was a tattered duffel bag, waterlogged and covered in mud. Inside, wrapped in layers of duct tape, were more personal belongings, driver's licenses, jewelry, and a child's stuffed rabbit with one button eye missing. All items that matched names from our missing persons list. But here was the twist that made every detective freeze. The fisherman swore he'd seen a man watching him from the far bank of the bayou just before he dragged the bag up. He described him as tall, thin, with a limp in his right leg. The problem? The suspect we had in custody? He didn't limp. Never had. That one detail shattered whatever little confidence we still held. I studied the duffel bag, noticing something the others had missed. A faint emblem stitched into the lining. It wasn't just any bag. It was military issue. Outdated, but still recognizable. A type handed out to soldiers nearly 2 decades ago. Which meant our real killer wasn't just some random predator. He was disciplined, trained, and meticulous enough to plant evidence and let another man take the fall. That night, I sat alone with the files spread across my desk, connecting dots no one wanted to see. Several victims had one thing in common. They lived near old military housing complexes on the city's edge, places most officers wouldn't even think twice about. I leaned back, heart racing, and realized the truth I didn't want to admit. The Bayou Killer wasn't just still out there. He'd been 3 steps ahead of us from the very beginning. And if the fisherman really did see him watching, it meant he wanted us to know.
The precinct was quiet that night, just the low hum of the fluorescent lights and the tapping of keyboards echoing down the hall. I had convinced my captain to let me dig into old military records, even though it meant crossing into federal territory. Technically, I wasn't supposed to have clearance for what I was about to see, but at this point, protocol felt like a luxury we couldn't afford. I started with the emblem from the duffel bag. It was linked to a specific supply unit stationed out of Louisiana in the early 2000s. That gave me a narrow list, no more than 50 names. One by one, I combed through, checking discharge records, service histories, and last known addresses. Most of the men had moved on, living quiet civilian lives. But then I saw it, a name that made my stomach twist. Daniel Rourke. Born and raised less than 20 miles from the bayou. Former combat engineer, discharged after multiple disciplinary issues. known for disappearing for long stretches and popping back up in small towns along the coast. Last recorded address, an abandoned trailer near the water's edge, less than a mile from where that fisherman claimed he'd seen a limping man. The more I read, the worse it got. He'd been investigated years ago for assault, but charges mysteriously vanished. He'd filed under multiple aliases since then, moving from job to job, never staying long. A ghost hiding in plain sight. I printed everything I could and laid it across the squad room table. The profile fit too perfectly. The limp, the discipline, the ability to plan and cover his tracks. This wasn't random violence. It was organized, methodical. Still, something gnawed at me. If Rourke really was our man, then why leave behind the duffel bag? Why allow a fisherman to see him? It was too deliberate, too neat. Then it hit me. This wasn't a mistake. This was a challenge. Rourke wanted us to know his name. He wanted us to find him. By the time the sun rose, I had enough to convince my captain to green light a raid on the trailer. We rolled out in unmarked vehicles, cutting through the fog that clung to the bayou like a second skin. My gut told me we were walking straight into his trap, but turning back wasn't an option anymore. We reached the trailer just after dawn. It looked abandoned, rust eating through the metal, windows boarded up. But there was movement inside, just enough to confirm someone was home. My hand tightened on my weapon. Every instinct screamed this was it. We were about to come face to face with the Bayou Killer.
The morning air was thick with mist, the kind that clings to your lungs and makes every breath feel heavy. Our team spread out around the trailer, weapons raised, radios crackling with tense whispers. I could hear my own pulse hammering in my ears as we approached the door. "Police, open up!" one of the officers shouted. No response. We stacked against the frame, battering ram in place. On the count of 3, the door gave way with a screech of rusted hinges. The inside smelled of mildew and rot, the kind of odor that seeps into the walls. But beneath it was something worse, something metallic and sharp, like blood. The living room was a shrine to chaos. Maps of the bayou pinned to the walls, with markings that matched every recovery site of the missing victims. Old military gear stacked in corners, and photographs, hundreds of them, faces of the missing, taped to the walls like trophies. Then we heard it, a dragging sound, faint but deliberate, coming from the back room. We moved in formation, each step calculated. I pushed the bedroom door open, and there he was, Daniel Rourke. Gaunt, pale, eyes burning with something feral. His right leg dragged slightly as he stepped forward, confirming the fisherman's story. For a moment, he just stared at us, lips curling into a faint smile. "Took you long enough," he muttered. Then chaos exploded. Rourke reached behind his back, pulling a blade, lunging with surprising speed. Shots rang out, deafening in the small space. The struggle was brutal, a flash of steel, shouts, and the acrid smell of gunpowder. When the dust settled, Rourke lay on the floor, bleeding out, but still smiling. He coughed, blood staining his teeth, and whispered, "There are more out there. You'll never stop it." And with that, he was gone. Silence swallowed the room.
broken only by the heavy breathing of my team. We secured the scene, cataloged every piece of evidence. The case was over, at least on paper, but Rourke's final words burrowed into my mind like a parasite. Back at the precinct, I filed the report, the weight of closure feeling more hollow than I'd expected. Families would get their answers, the city would sleep easier, but I knew the truth. Evil like Rourke's doesn't just disappear. It lingers, waits, festers in the dark corners of the world. And as I sat in my office, staring at the wall of files, I realized something chilling. The Bayou Killer may be dead, but the story wasn't over. Because monsters like him, they always leave behind shadows.